corners is the word that you've used, which you believe that the report seems to suggest. Let's then talk about that. Given the manner in which this has played out, should the regulator have intervened earlier when the stocks seem to be rising to abnormally high levels? Does this show somewhere that the regulator has not done enough to investigate or inquire into some of the troubling issues that are being raised only now?
Probably. But I think it's less to do with corruption and politics and more to do with inertia and indifference. I mean, I know how regulators work. They're risk averse, and especially in India, if you're a regulator, you want to make sure you don't take an action where you face the downside. So it's almost a system that's tilted towards inaction. So if there's a fault here, it's because we've designed a system where we tied the hands of regulators, and it's easy to pick on them and say, you should have done this, you should have done that, but if they get the downside of their actions, why would you ever expect them to go out of the way? So they're going to take narrow views of the rules because that's the safest place for them to be. So I think that's more a reflection of how Indian regulation works and how the system is set up to punish people who go out of their way to try to be creative and try to catch companies. They get punished. So why would you ever go out of your way to do it? You're going to check the box and say, you know what, they checked the box. It's not my fault. So I attribute that more to indifference and inertia than to any degree of corruption. I could be completely wrong on this one, but I don't think that it was corruption or politics that was the driving force. It might have contributed that they have connections. But I think it's less that and more the indifference and inertia that is so much at the heart of Indian regulation.
I'm going to come to those political connections, Professor, later, but you're saying inertia or indifference on the part of the regulator prima facie. The other big question, do you see Gautam Adani company's high debt as a concern or as a normal given the infrastructure areas in which he has bet big on? Is that something that should concern people who've invested in Adani companies or are leveraged to Adani?
It's normal and it's concerning. They're not either or, right? I mean, in a sense, infrastructure companies always borrow a lot of money. And they're at the mercy of the regulators because they often run quasi-utilities. An airport, for instance. You can't give a private company complete power to raise prices, right? Because if you did that, you'd be driving airlines out of gates and, charging customers 3 times more. So the businesses that the Adanis are in are low-margin businesses, even in their best days, but they're very, very capital-intensive businesses. And for whatever reason, and this is not the Adani's fault, going back 100 years, infrastructure companies have always used a lot of debt. They've used a lot of debt because their view is, once we build it, then we'll find a way to keep paying the interest. And you can't just blame the Adanis. Banks lend not based on earnings power or cash flows. They like to lend on big physical assets, right? Look at the real estate business. If you think about cash flows, nobody should be lending on Mumbai real estate. There isn't enough rental income in an expensive piece of real estate property. But you know what? Bankers like to lend on big physical assets. Infrastructure businesses feed on that. So this is, and I don't think you can make that a crime. You can argue that this is a bad risk. You should not be borrowing so much money that your operating income is only 1.4 times your interest expense. There's not much buffer. That's a debate worth having, not just about the Adani Group, but about infrastructure businesses collectively. No, I think that the debt is concerning as an investor, but it's concerning to me across a whole range of infrastructure companies, not just the Adani Group.